I'm Matthew Griffis of the Oxford County Library, and my presentation today is about the history of Carnegie libraries here in Oxford County, a story that began over 100 years ago in the early 20th century. Some may not know or have a clear idea of what a Carnegie library is. Basically, a Carnegie library was a library built with funds provided by Scottish-born American steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie. I'll tell you more about Andrew Carnegie, who he was, and why he loved funding libraries so much in just a few minutes. First, I want to give you a little bit of background and why this subject interests me so much. I'm from Peterborough, Ontario originally. We had a Carnegie library there located on George Street. It was built in 1910 and opened in very early 1911. I worked for some years at the Peterborough Public Library, but by then, the library organization had relocated to its current building, which opened in 1980 on Aylmer Street. The former Carnegie building was later converted into a wing of City Hall, which remains its purpose today. So I never worked in the original Carnegie building, but I certainly heard a lot about it when I worked for the Peterborough Library back in the late 1990s. My interest in Carnegie libraries began when I was in college, and later, when I lived in Toronto, it grew into something quite serious, with many of the Toronto Public Library's oldest library buildings being Carnegie buildings. For example, the Riverdale branch, the Yorkville branch, the Beaches and Wychwood branches, and of course the original Toronto Reference Library on College Street, which today serves as the U of T's Koffler Student Center. It was originally the largest Carnegie library ever built in Canada. Anyway, since entering the library science field about 15 years ago, I've devoted a lot of time to researching Carnegie libraries in the United States and Canada, and even several years ago had the pleasure of touring the very first Carnegie library ever built anywhere, which was in 1883 in Andrew Carnegie's hometown of Dunfermline, Scotland. So these Carnegie libraries were a global phenomenon and in many ways changed the course of modern public library development around the world. Certainly in North America it did. So while the Oxford County contexts are in many ways just a tiny, very tiny chapter of that larger story, they're worth remembering for a lot of reasons. There were 5 Carnegie libraries that opened here in Oxford County between 1909 and 1917. These were in Woodstock, Ingersoll, Norwich, Tillsonburg, and Tavistock. So anyway, let's begin at the beginning. With what is a Carnegie library? Well, first let me describe what the state of public libraries was over 100 years ago in Ontario, specifically in the late 19th and very early 20th centuries, so around 1895-1900. There isn't really time to explain the origins of modern public libraries, the story of the public library movement, as it's sometimes called, which began in North America anyway, in the upper eastern United States, the New England states specifically, back in the mid to late 19th century. But the gist of that story is that from about the 1850s to the 1890s, many cities and towns began to establish free, tax-supported public libraries for their residents to use. And this was part of the progressive era, as historians often call it, which was gaining momentum in the mid-19th century, when a strong belief persisted that government could, and perhaps even should, take a more active role in looking after its citizens, when public services of all kinds were expanding, the public education system, for example. And so public libraries became a part of that movement. To progressives, open access to learning was essential to modern democracy, and public libraries, unlike primary and secondary public schools, helped people of all ages learn and improve themselves. I think it's fair to say that of all provinces in Canada, Ontario was affected earliest by the public library movement, although by 1900 there were relatively few free public libraries here in Ontario. Public libraries existed, but many were still membership-based, which meant that you'd have to pay an annual fee to join. So even if a library was tax-supported to some extent, very few of them were truly free to use. Another issue was that at the time, even if a city or town could establish and support a free public library organization, the city or town in question often didn't have the means to build a modern library facility building, which by 1900 was emerging. Libraries were emerging as their own building type. Some architects in the United States, for example, among them Henry Hobson Richardson, were beginning to specialize, or at least gain a reputation, for designing library buildings. And certainly large universities and large cities like Boston could afford to build purpose-designed library buildings. But for most of the towns and cities in North America, That just wasn't the case. If they had a public library, they probably housed it in a small store building in their downtown somewhere. Perhaps they used an old house, or they'd house the public library in a couple of rooms in their town hall. Now, the image that you've been looking at on the screen here for the last couple of minutes is not in Oxford County, but in the neighboring Elgin County, in the town of Aylmer specifically. And this is Aylmer's main street, Talbot Street, as it appeared in the very early 1900s. And if you look closely, I realize this isn't the best scan, but if you look closely, you'll see at the far left a sign in one of the shop windows that says library, or just above one of the shop windows there. And this is very much how towns and smaller centers operated their libraries in the pre-Carnegie days. Again, it was often in a store or commercial building somewhere downtown. This is just Aylmer, but this was very typical of many Ontario towns at the time. Before we move on, I want to show you this. So, a nearby example of a city that kind of had it good. This is the London, Ontario Public Library's first library building. It's not a Carnegie building. They never had a Carnegie building in London, actually. This was built, I'm trying to remember, I think it was around 1895. I'm not certain of that, but it was around then anyway. A few years before the Carnegie Library program began anyway. But there were a few public libraries. There were other public libraries in Ontario that had the luxury of building what was then considered a modern library facility, and this was London's. But again, they were few. This building has long since been demolished, by the way. So no wonder something like the Carnegie Library Building Program, which Andrew Carnegie began on an international basis around 1899, would become so popular so quickly. Who was Andrew Carnegie, and why did he care so much about libraries? Well, by 1900, Carnegie was one of the wealthiest people in the world. As I said earlier, he was a Scottish-born American industrialist. He made his hundreds of millions primarily in steel manufacturing. He was the Carnegie of the Carnegie Steel Company, which was based largely in the greater Pittsburgh area. And Carnegie believed in philanthropy, and he gave to many causes, but his most cherished cause was the support and development of free public libraries. And after funding the construction of several public libraries in Scotland, and then in the greater Pittsburgh area, in the late 1890s, he turned his attention to funding public libraries pretty much anywhere in the English-speaking world. And from about 1899 to the early 1920s, his fortune paid for the construction of over 2,500 libraries worldwide. Carnegie was, as he described it, a self-made man. He'd worked as an immigrant child in factories, then later as a teenager he worked as a telegraph delivery boy. He later began working for railways and the construction of railways and then the manufacturing of steel. And he credited his success entirely to self-education, to his teaching himself from books. And so as a philanthropist, he believed that the best gift, quote unquote, those are his words, the best gift a community could receive was a free public library. And so when he retired, he devoted much of his personal fortune to advancing the public library cause. And so by the early 1900s, mayors and library board members from towns and cities from all over began writing to Carnegie's offices in New York City, asking if Carnegie would consider funding the construction of a library building in their community. So Carnegie appointed James Bertram, who'd been his personal assistant before he retired, as manager of this library building program, and that's who you see here on the left, sitting with Carnegie. That's James Bertram. And James Bertram created a whole system for this program. He devised an application form for communities to complete and return by mail, and there were several conditions a community had to meet if it wanted a Carnegie Library grant. First, their library had to be a free, tax-supported library, not a membership or fee-based one. The community also had to agree to support their Carnegie Library annually at a rate of at least 10% of the Carnegie grant. They also had to provide a site. Carnegie's funds paid only for the building. The community had to provide the site and also had to pay for all the library books and furnishings and equipment. And so once a community fulfilled or promised to fulfill, pledged to fulfill those basic conditions, James Bertram, on Carnegie's behalf, would approve that community's application and eventually release funds to that community. I said earlier that by the early 1920s, which was essentially when the last Carnegie libraries were built here in North America, the program had funded the construction of just over 2,500 libraries. Well, just under 1,700 of those were built in the United States, and 125 of them in Canada. And of those 125 Canadian Carnegie libraries, 111 of those were built here in Ontario. Now, why were so many of them built in Ontario? Well, that's really the subject of another presentation. There are several reasons, but there isn't time to get into them here. But 5 of those 111 were built here in Oxford County. So let's have a look at them. Now, the earliest of those 5 Carnegie libraries was built in the town of Woodstock, which received a total of $20,000 from Carnegie for its library. I should have mentioned earlier that James Bertram had a formula for calculating grant size according to a town or city's population at last census. Woodstock's Carnegie building was designed by Chadwick and Beckett, an architectural firm in Toronto, and it opened on the northeast corner of Hunter and Graham Streets in January 1909. And what we see here is an old postcard image of the Woodstock Carnegie Library. I have many postcard images of these libraries in my personal collection. I'll have time to share only some of them here, though. If you've been downtown Woodstock and you've even just driven past this building, it's a little hard to miss and then hard to forget. It is, in my opinion, one of the nicest Carnegie libraries in North America. And these are the original blueprints, or part of the original blueprints for the building. The blueprints designed by Chadwick and Beckett. These are from the Woodstock Public Library's collections, and I thank them, by the way, for letting me share them with you here. This is just the main floor. The building had 3 levels, a functional basement, a main floor for its book collections and reading rooms, and a small upper mezzanine area with an office for the chief librarian. Now, this is a little hard to look at, I understand, so here's a positive version, a clearer version of the main floor plan. And you know that in many ways this is not the most practical, not even by 1909 standards, but when the library opened, the Woodstock Sentinel Review called it, quote, one of the most handsome, artistic, and complete library buildings in Western Ontario. So that was quite a compliment, and I have to agree. And this library remains one of the earliest public library buildings I've ever seen to include public restrooms. Not many public libraries offered those kinds of amenities until much, much later. So it's really remarkable to see them in a building that was really designed. It was opened in 1909, but it was designed back in 06, 07. And, you know, though it's not very practical, I do love the pillared rotunda right in the middle of the main floor here, and which is still there, by the way. Yeah, here we go. Although renovations in the mid-1990s turned it into a kind of well, as you see, but this is how the library's main level still appears today, actually. Well, in this photograph, how it appeared 12 years ago when I was there and I was allowed to photograph it. This, of course, is still the Woodstock Public Library's building. Although Woodstock never became part of the Oxford County Library system, Woodstock's was the county's first Carnegie Library, and it remains the only Carnegie building in the county still operating as a library. It underwent a major renovation and expansion in the mid-1990s, and what you see here is the spacious addition built on the original Carnegie structure's back. So this is an addition at the back. And this addition was designed by Philip H. Carter, an architect of whom I'm a big fan, an architect well known for designing additions to historic library buildings that are very sympathetic to the style of the original building. Carter also designed the addition to the Port Hope Carnegie Library and also for a few of the Toronto branch libraries. Here's a photo of the main reference desk. Again, I took this photo about 12 years ago, but it looks much the same now. That portrait of Carnegie that hangs on the wall there, that was something the Carnegie Corporation sent to all Carnegie Library communities in the 1930s to display if they so chose. And here, Woodstock still has its print, which is really nice to see. The building's front exterior remains much the same, too. I've included in the upper right here just a reminder of how those front steps originally appeared. But in the main picture, you can see how during the the renovation project in the mid-1990s, how they excavated those original front steps so that we now go down rather than up to enter the library. And we enter not by the main floor anymore, but by what had originally been the basement, which helps make the building more accessible. I love this. Just when you're across the street, this is just a wonderful solution, I think, to a problem that many Carnegie libraries face, which is how to get around those really intimidating, imposing front steps. In Woodstock's case, when you're across the street and you're looking at the building at sidewalk level from just across the street, it's almost like an illusion. It's really clever the way they did it here. It really doesn't look much different. You can't see it unless you walk up to the pillars that actually there are ramps and steps that go down rather than up. Now the other 4 Carnegie libraries on this list I know less about. I have been researching them much less actually than I have the Woodstock Library, but nor have I ever had the pleasure of visiting any of them in person, at least not the interior anyway. But the next Carnegie Library to open in Oxford County was in Ingersoll, which received $10,000 from Carnegie and opened its new library in July 1910. And Ingersoll's library was designed by local architect Thomas Nagel, and it stood on Charles Street East, just a half block from Thames Street. And Nagel based his design loosely on Waterloo's Carnegie Library of 1905. That's Waterloo, Ontario. And if you Google a photo of that library which still stands, it's now the Habitat for Humanity headquarters, if you're familiar with the Waterloo area. But if you Google a photo of that library, you'll see, just by comparing the two buildings' exteriors, how Ingersoll's library was kind of like a junior version of that building. And from what I've heard from those who visited the Ingersoll Library in its prime, it was a truly enchanting building inside. When the Ingersoll Carnegie Library became a branch of the Oxford County Library System in 1969, it continued to operate out of its Carnegie building for many years after, but despite attempts to update and improve the building, the branch relocated in 1996 to its current building on King Street West. Now, I don't have any floor plans for Ingersoll's Carnegie Library, unfortunately, nor do I have any images of its interior to share with you today. But I do have several vintage postcard images of its exterior, like this one, which is, we're looking westward here, looking west on Charles Street East towards the intersection at Thames, and that's the old post office clock tower, I believe, that we're seeing there. I'm just getting to know the layout of Greater Ingersoll. For years, the only building I knew, the only historic building in Ingersoll that I was aware of was the Carnegie Library, so I'm pretty sure I have my directions correct. You'll also notice how much plainer the library's exterior is when compared to Woodstock's, and this is a pattern we're going to see when we look at all these other libraries chronologically. After 1908, the Carnegie program insisted that it approve all blueprints before it released any building funds to communities. James Bertram was concerned that local architects were maybe getting a little carried away with the pillars and the domes and the fancy schmancy stuff, and they weren't, extravagances basically, as the Carnegie program saw them anyway. And that the architects were perhaps not focused enough on designing sort of plainer, more practical library buildings. Now, today, this building is still with us. It still stands, and it serves as Carnegie Hall, a privately owned and operated special events venue. I haven't yet had the chance to get inside this building, but one day I hope to. And from what I'm told by many, the current owners have done a really wonderful job of repurposing the building. We're lucky to still have this building with us. Now, the current Ingersoll branch on King Street has not forgotten its past, not at all. Inside is this commemorative watercolor sketch painted by local artist Lou Palmer and donated to the library in 1997 by Donald and Jean Hillis. And just a few feet away from that is Ingersoll's original Carnegie portrait, which used to hang in the old Carnegie Library on Charles Street. And so Tillsonburg's library was next, and Tillsonburg opened its Carnegie Library in 1915 after receiving a grant of $10,000 from Carnegie. And this library stood on the southwest corner of Broadway and Washington Grand Avenue, directly across from Tillsonburg's Old Town Hall. And this was a smaller library. It was designed by Guelph's William Austin Mahoney, or W.A. Mahoney, who was by far the most prolific architect of Carnegie libraries in Ontario. He designed at least 15 of them that we know of. And so this is the library as it appeared when it was finished. But here's a rare shot I wanted to show you. I was taken around, I'm guessing, maybe 1910, 1912. This is the site where Tillsonburg eventually built its Carnegie Library. So this is what it looked like before the building, before they broke ground. And here's another photo taken from the same angle, maybe about a year or two after the library was completed and opened. This image, by the way, is from the Toronto Public Library's collections. And like I said, it's a small building, but there's still a majesty to this. These Carnegie libraries, however small they happen to be, were considered jewels of civic architecture. For many communities, to get a Carnegie library was, a source of pride. It was a tremendous boost to the town or the city's reputation. And it's interesting to read the surviving correspondence between the chief librarians of many of these Carnegie libraries in their early years especially. And you sense a kind of bond or kinship that they felt as librarians, not just of any public library, but a Carnegie public library specifically. Tillsonburg's Carnegie Library was also one of just a few libraries in Canada, and certainly among the smallest of those, to use book stacks manufactured by the famous Sneed and Company Ironworks of New Jersey, whose book stacks filled other larger, more famous libraries like Harvard University's library, Columbia's Low Library, and the Library of Congress, just to give three examples. And these were very heavy-duty contraptions for storing books, very inflexible too. But Tillsonburg's library had their Sneed book stacks up until the very end. And the very end was 1974. Tillsonburg demolished its Carnegie Library building in 1974 to make room for this larger, more modern building you see here, which today serves as the Tillsonburg branch of the Oxford County Library. Tillsonburg joined the Oxford County Library system in 2013. And like Ingersoll, Tillsonburg has paid tribute to its former building. This interior mural was completed by artist Ches Sokowski in 2013, a project funded by the local council of the Knights of Columbus. Now, next is Norwich. Norwich completed its Carnegie Library in late 1915 on Stover and Elgin Streets near the center of town. Norwich received the smallest library grant of any in the county. Norwich was, population-wise, among the smallest communities that made an application, and its grant was $7,000. But they did well, even with such a small grant. Norwich's Carnegie Library was a simple but elegant red brick rectangle. And this is what you see here is kind of a design increasingly typical of later Carnegie libraries, actually. Many of the later ones were so often rectangular that library planners and architects even today sometimes still refer to this concept, this form, as, quote, the Carnegie rectangle. Anyway, this postcard view of the library is from about 1916, 1917. Here's another shot of the library, taken in the early 1950s, I believe. You'll notice the front steps have changed a little bit. I'll go back. Changed a little bit. And here is the building as it appears today. Norwich's Carnegie building became a branch of the Oxford County Library system in 1965. In 2006, the branch moved into a new building several blocks away on Tidy Street. Although its interior was renovated in the early 1970s, the Carnegie building experienced no major structural expansions or changes, not that I know of, anyway. And today, the building looks much as it did when it opened in late 1915. It now houses local businesses. Now, the last of Oxford County's Carnegie libraries was Tavistock's library, which was built with a $7,500 Carnegie grant and which opened in March 1917. Tavistock's library was a handsome red brick building that faced Maria Street, and it was designed by James Russell of Stratford, who, by the way, also served as the architect of the Stratford Carnegie Library. Next to Woodstock's, Tavistock's Carnegie building hung in there perhaps the longest. It joined the newly formed Oxford County Library system in 1965, and then, when it closed permanently in August 2010, it was the Oxford County system's last operating Carnegie Library. Now, the building still stands, but it's been modified and expanded into retirement housing, a building now named Carnegie Manor in honor of what it used to be, which I think was quite nice. There's still a Tavistock branch of the Oxford County Library, of course, and it resides on the ground floor of the former Oxford Hotel on Woodstock Street, another of Tavistock's historical structures. Now, there's a sixth chapter to this story, a Carnegie Library that was almost built, but wasn't, and that was in Otterville, and it was intended actually as a Carnegie Library for all of South Norwich Township. And Otterville was promised a grant. It was supposed to be $6,000. But for various reasons, South Norwich Township never moved forward with the project. And in 1923, the Carnegie Corporation, which by then had taken over the library program, rescinded that grant. Now, there's a lot more to this part of the story, but I'm actually saving that for next year's Oxford Local History Day, so stay tuned. And just to wrap up, what was the impact of the Carnegie Library program in Oxford County? Well, it was much the same as its impact most everywhere else. It helped accelerate the movement towards free public libraries in Oxford County, which is significant since Oxford County was predominantly rural in the early 20th century, and those parts of provinces and states were often among the slowest to develop free public libraries. The Carnegie program also afforded these communities their first modern, purpose-built library buildings, which in turn helped these libraries as organizations be perceived more by their users as important organizations. More than a century ago, brick and mortar, especially on a scale like we've seen here with these buildings, helped create or affect a sense of permanence, of endurance to these libraries. And to their credit, these Carnegie buildings lasted a good many decades longer than anyone originally expected. So to Carnegie's credit, they were indeed lasting investments in a community. And Oxford County had 5 of them. So we should feel proud, I think, of that. Now, if you'd like to read more about Carnegie Libraries in Ontario, I strongly recommend either or both of these 2 books. Lauren Bruce's Free Books for All, The Public Library Movement in Ontario, 1850-1930, covers the wider library movement in Ontario, public library movement, I should say, in Ontario in the early 20th century. And then on the right there is Margaret Beckman's, Stephen Langmead, and John Black's The Best Gift, which was published in 1984 and covers the history of the Carnegie Library program, specifically in Ontario. And most public libraries, I would say, have at least one, if not both, of these titles in their collection. At Oxford County, we have copies in our collection, so if you'd like to read them, come pay us a visit. So thank you. Thank you again for viewing my presentation today. I'll end with some credits and thank yous, and I look forward to seeing all of you again next year for Oxford Local History Day 2023.